Hi guys, my name is Detective Squirtle, and I'm coming at you with my first YouTube video. So this is a series called Cards and Crime, and it is essentially a Pokemon pack opening series with a little bit of a twist. During our pack openings, we're going to be talking about the real-life historical account of serial killers. Because of that, there is viewer discretion advised, because sometimes things can get pretty graphic. Okay, so today we're going to be opening Sun and Moon team-up packs, as you can see here. And for our first historical account, we're going to be taking a look at Mary Ann Cotton, who is also sometimes known as the Black Widow or the Angel of Death. Mary Ann, as I'm going to call her, is an English serial killer born on October 31st, yes really, of 1832, to Michael and Margaret Robeson. She had a sister who was born in 1834, but died only a few months later, and one brother named Robert, who was born in 1835. In her early life, she was described by her Sunday school superintendent as a most exemplary and a regular attender, with innocent disposition and an average intelligence. Things took a downfall, however, when during work her father fell 150 feet to his death down a mine shaft. Because Mary Ann and her parents' home was tied to the employment of her father, they were ultimately evicted from that. Shortly thereafter, Mary Ann's mother married George Stott, another miner. To my understanding, this gave them back some normalcy and stability. And at the age of 16, Mary Ann actually left home to become a nurse in a nearby city. And from what I've gathered about this place and time, nurse was basically a person who went to people's house and took care of them, sort of like a home hospice thing we have today. And that's what she did. After a couple years, she returned home to her stepfather's house and trained as a dressmaker. In 1852, she was 20 years of age when she married her first husband, William Marbury. Shortly after being married, they moved to somewhere in southwest England. So, with William, she had what is believed to be up to 9 children, 4 or 5 who were believed to have died in infancy. So, it seems like only one of the births was actually recorded, and none of those deaths, so we're not exactly sure how many. While it was required to register birth and deaths at the time, it wasn't actually enforced until a couple of years later. Some of the children we do know about that she had, though, were 3 daughters and a son. We know at least 2 of them died in their toddler years, and it's claimed that the others might have died, but death records were scarcely recorded at that time, as I said. So, on comes the year 1865, where William, her husband, supposedly dies of some sort of intestinal disorder. And many believe this is the first of her victims, because, as we're going to talk about, her method of murder was arsenic, which could show some of the same signs as the believed intestinal disorder. It's believed that she began and continued her murder spree in an attempt to get an insurance payout, as her husband and child were covered. She collected 35 British pounds sterling, which was equivalent to about half a year of manual laborer's salary at the time. Shortly after her first husband's death, another one of her daughters died, believed to be of typhoid. So at this point, she has one of 8 or 9 of her children she's believed to have given birth to. After that death, she moved to Sunderland and started working in an infirmary. Because of the serious risk of contagion, she sent her last child to live with her mother. While she was working at the infirmary, she met George Ward, who she quickly married. I believe it was only 7 months after the death of her first husband. After just over a year, George Ward died, and his listed cause of death was cholera and typhoid. Physicians characterized his illness with problems such as partial paralysis and intestinal problems, which once again shows similarities with arsenic. At the time of his death, his doctors did admit to him being ill, but he was seriously surprised that the death was so sudden. She once again collected on her husband's death. Shortly after her second husband's death, she became a housekeeper for a man named James Robinson. 1 month after Mary Ann was hired, James' son John died of gastric fever. After this, it seemed like James leaned on Mary Ann for comfort, and they eventually ended up getting together, and she became pregnant in early 1867. Also around this time, her mother became ill with hepatitis, so she went to go care for her mother. And as you guys know how people who care for Mary Ann end up, she started complaining of stomach pains and died just 9 days after Mary's arrival. After the death of her mother, she brought her daughter Isabella, her daughter from her marriage to William, who she sent back while she was working at the infirmary, if you remember, to come back with her and James to care for her. And once again, you can imagine how that went. Shortly after arriving back to James's house, her daughter, as well as 2 of James's other children, soon developed stomach pains and died in early 1867. They were all buried shortly after in late April, early May, and Mary Ann was able to collect on the insurance of Isabella, her daughter. And then, in August of 67, Mary and James were married. I'm not sure what he was thinking, but okay. And in November, their first child was born, but she quickly became ill and died in February of 1868. Things were apparently quiet for a short time, and they had their second child, George, in June of 1869. It turns out things weren't actually that quiet, as following suspicion of Mary Ann's constant insistence that he get life insurance, James finds out that Mary had run up some serious debts
and also found out that she had been forcing his older children to pawn off his valuables. He threw her out, which ultimately probably saved his life. Following this, Mary Ann was living on the streets when her friend Margaret Cotton, there is no relation from what I understand, introduced her to her brother, Frederick. Margaret was acting as a mother for Frederick's children, and as he had recently become widowed. And in March of 1870, unfortunately, Margaret died from an undetermined stomach ailment. Mary Ann was then there to console Frederick, and her 12th pregnancy was now underway. They got married in September 1870, and their son Robert was born in early 71. Now comes the interesting part. After the birth of her son, she finds an ex-lover of hers who was living nearby, about 30 miles, and somehow convinced her current family to move there and rekindle the relationship with her ex-lover. I'm not sure and wasn't able to find if this was like a secret romantic relationship or the details of how that happened. What I do know is shortly after moving, her husband Frederick died from some sort of gastric fever. If you're keeping count now, that's 3 of her 4 husbands. After his death, she ended up being lodged by Natris, the lover she moved to be with. She was then hired again as a nurse. Could you imagine hiring a woman who's lost nearly 12 children and 4 husbands as a nurse? And she ends up becoming pregnant with the man who she was assigned to nurse. A couple of months after that, her lover Joseph became ill with gastric fever and died shortly after. Okay, guys. Thankfully, her reign of terror is finally coming to an end. A little later that year, she was asked by a parish official to help nurse an ill woman with smallpox, but she complained that the last child of Frederick Cotton, Charles, was in the way and asked if the parish official could admit him to a workhouse. He declined, and in all her arrogance, she replied by saying that he would be dealt with soon, just like the rest of the Cottons. And that's exactly what she did, and Charles died just a few days later. The parish official, however, went to authorities and convinced the doctors to not write a death certificate until things could be investigated. Of course, the first thing Mary did was not go to the doctors about the boy's death, but went to the insurance agency, who refused to pay out without a certificate of death. Unfortunately, after investigating and finding out about 3 lost husbands, lost lover, lost friend, lost mother, and 11 children, Mary was arrested and charged with the murder of the Cotton boy. The trial was delayed a little bit so that she could give birth to her daughter, who she named Margaret. After the trial began, and after the conclusion of the trial, the jury deliberated for only 90 minutes, returning a guilty verdict. She was sentenced to death by hanging, and on March 24th of 1873 she was hanged, leaving only 2 children who survived her, the infant Margaret and George from her 3rd marriage to her husband James. Well, guys, that's the story of the Black Widow. If you made it this far in the video, I just want to say thank you so much for sticking around during my first video. If you enjoyed for the pack opening or the story of Mary Ann, a like, comment, or subscription would mean the world to me. Thanks again, guys.